In my research, I explore how communities use theater in particular and performance in general to create community, a sense of belonging, and to preserve memory. And specifically, as Andra mentioned, I investigate the intersections of race, performance, and everyday life. So how we perform ourselves in everyday life. I use performance studies, critical race theory, and cultural geography paired with archival research, performance analysis, and experiential fieldwork to explore how performance supports and challenges structures of racialized oppression. Today, I will be talking about a section of my current book project, Extraordinary Violence, Performance, Race, and the Making of Gun Culture in America. This talk will focus specifically on the ways that Black Americans during the long civil rights movement used performances of gun ownership to protest oppression and demand inclusion in the national community, and ultimately how those performances changed both theater and gun culture. In Extraordinary Violence, I examine how performance and racialized thinking have shaped the distinct gun culture in the United States. In particular, I claim that reading gun culture through performance studies by examining everyday performances of gun ownership, plays that depict gun violence or reference it, and in particular legal documents, so laws and trial transcripts, et cetera, can reveal why gun violence and our cultural investment in gun ownership in the United States is so intractable, and why that violence affects Black and Native American communities more than others. I bring gun culture and performance into conversation in order to explore how the attachment to guns in the United States and also the aversion to them have both been produced through performative acts, narrative tropes, gestures, and images. Performance has shaped the contours of gun culture in the United States in both perceptual and embodied ways, from Roger Taney's evocation of moral panic over the presumed public performance of Black citizenship rights in the Dred Scott decision, to the spread of gunslinger iconography through Wild West shows that traveled across the United States and throughout Europe, to the embodied scenarios of engagement that choreograph encounters with the police in the Black Lives Matter era. Performance and gun culture have been inextricably linked in ways that have heretofore been understudied. I began this research in response to several highly publicized events in the years of 2012 to 2014. The shooting deaths of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and John Crawford III, the militarized government response to the Ferguson uprising, and the standoff between the Bundy ranching family and the right-wing militias that came to support them in Nevada. In each of these events, the public brandishing of guns played a primary role, but with very different outcomes. It was clear that visible racialized difference influenced these encounters, and I began to wonder if performance theory, particularly the concept of the performance of everyday life, might help me decipher them. So my book responds to four primary questions. Why are laws protecting and conscribing gun rights applied differently across racialized communities? Number two, how are legal rights performed in general? Number three, how do people perform with and around guns? And number four, how does performance produce gun culture? By putting gun culture and performance into conversation, my book develops two core arguments. So the first is that gun ownership and brandishment are performances of belonging. They are ways of saying, I am a part of the civic fabric. However, the reception and effectiveness of those gestures are conditioned on proximity to whiteness. And as a corollary, the social and juridical structures that underpin gun culture in the United States are the product of pervasive anti-Blackness. And then number two, guns are inherently performative objects that alter the behavior, both of those who wield them and those who encounter them, particularly in public spaces. And so I want to make a note here that the primary focus of my work is gun culture encounters that happen in public spaces. So there's a lot of ownership in private homes that takes place between families, et cetera. That is less of what I'm looking at, and I'm really more looking at how this happens in public spaces. So gun culture in the United States produces consequences that play out in the everyday lives of all Americans. So the United States has the highest per capita ownership of guns throughout the world, far and away. We also have the highest rate of gun violence among peer nations, but those consequences of gun culture have disproportionate impacts, particularly on Black and Indigenous communities. The most salient impact, I believe, is that some kinds of gun violence are marked as quotidian, everyday, necessary types of violence, while other types are spectacularized, and that this process of naturalization and spectacularization is fueled by theatrical performances, is fueled by sort of our cultural products, as well as performances of gun ownership and brandishment. And I argue that not sort of uncovering these performances can actually work against our efforts to comprehend and even reduce gun violence. Understanding how gun culture is produced by performance illuminates how it functions and can help us unravel its grip on American life. That's my dream. That's the pie in the sky. Okay, I do want to make a short note here about the use of my use of the term gun culture. So the everyday influence of firearms and the increasing polarization of attitudes about gun rights is such that even the term gun culture is controversial and is often viewed as pejorative, a pejorative created by activists, anti-gun activists, and journalists. But the United States as a whole is saturated with guns, both practically and imaginatively. It is a society whose public life is compromised by the ubiquity of firearms, whose history is rooted in gun violence, and whose entertainment continues to mine both the present and the past for romanticized representations of gun use. It is also a society whose founding documents enshrine an enigmatic right to bear arms, the meaning of which continues to prompt debate within state and federal legislative bodies and in larger cultural conversations. Because of this, I believe gun culture is the appropriate term to describe the pervasive influence of guns, both as objects and as ideas. While my book includes case studies examining performance in gun culture from the mid-19th century to 2015, my talk today will focus on how guns and performance came together in what Jacqueline Dowd Hall calls the long civil rights movement. Specifically, I will talk about two performances of Black gun ownership. Number one, that of Dr. Ossian Sweet, whose spectacular armed defense of his home in segregated Detroit led to a theatrical trial and the creation of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund in 1925. It wasn't called that then, but it provided the seed money that turned into the Legal Defense Fund. And then number two, that of the Black Panther Party, whose spectacular armed defense of Black communities in Oakland, California, reflected a flair for theatrical protest and a transnational agenda of resistance. I argue that these two performances of gun ownership are an example of what I'm calling tactical lawfulness, or a mode of performed resistance that uses the law against itself. I will present these two case studies to illustrate how using performance theory and theater history can demystify US American gun culture and reveal how communities employ theater and performance to resist oppression. So in addition to, I'm not gonna go forward quite yet. In addition to increasing the number of figures and events that may be considered part of the civil rights movement, expanding the temporal boundaries of the movement also allows me to interrogate how we remember it today, to situate the beginning of the movement in the robust tradition of anti-lynching drama of the early 20th century, and to recenter the concerns regarding armed Black resistance that circulated at the time. Though movement leaders themselves emphasized the intertwined nature of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation, and challenged all three, popular memories of the movement often focus on the successful eradication of de jure discrimination, or discrimination in the text of the law, while rather than exploring the de facto discrimination that was more deeply embedded in American life and continues to shape the experiences and opportunities of Black Americans today. As such, many of the most searing visual moments of the era centered on actions demanding the right to perform civic belonging publicly, the right to vote, to move unmolested from place to place, to attend integrated schools, to occupy shared public spaces, and to choose where to live. Percolating within civil rights organizations, however, was a less publicly visible yet privately impassioned conversation about the right to bear arms, particularly whether a nonviolent civil rights movement could thrive alongside a robust public campaign for Black Americans' right to own and publicly use guns for self-defense, and quite frankly, whether the movement could survive without that. To explain how performances of gun ownership shaped both the trajectory of the civil rights movement and the development of gun culture in the United States, I've developed a concept of performing tactical lawfulness. Now, stick with me for just one second. So, French cultural theorist Michel de Certeau articulated his concept of strategies and tactics in the 1980s. And it was a way of describing how people within oppressive systems resist those systems. So we can't escape it, so what actually do we do to resist it? And how do we practice agency within those systems? So strategies are the ways that a structural unit, it could be a national government, a corporation, a police force, anything that sort of controls a space, right? Strategies are how they mark, control, and police a space. Who can come and go, what kind of performances you can engage in that space, etc. Tactics, on the other hand, are the fluid, responsive ways in which those without power, most often individuals living within this spatially demarcated area, resist those strategies, how they respond to them. So tactics work within the system and resist the system at the same time. So, for example, during the Jim Crow era, strategies included the legal and extra-legal means to police Black Americans' movement and public performances. The examples might be like sundown towns, segregated spaces, and tactics could include, for example, the use of the Negro Motorist Green Book, ways of resisting and pushing back against those. And then less overt performance tactics as well. So, for example, when WPA interviewers went out and interviewed formerly enslaved people, often enslaved people embedded kind of performances of resistance in those narratives. So while Certeau's concepts are useful, they're incomplete. And most pointedly, he fails to recognize that strategies function primarily as a means to control individuals' public performances, and that tactics, in order to actually be resistant, also have to be public. So by bringing the idea of tactical resistance into conversation with theories of performance in everyday life, I've refined and clarified Certeau's concepts in order to illuminate the way that public performances of self and community defense by Black Americans during the long civil rights movement resisted state-sponsored oppression. These public performances have another dimension that sets them apart. They are directly responding to and performatively deploying the text of the law as a means to challenge oppression. So I use the term performing tactical lawfulness to describe the ways in which marginalized groups within the nation state use the text of the law against itself by performing strict legality in the face of extra-legal oppression. So the two performances of gun ownership that I discussed today both mobilized actions of tactical lawfulness in order to resist the state's monopoly on violence. In his 1925 trial, Ossian Sweet appealed to a, quote, sacred ancient right for a man to defend his home and family. And in doing so, he positioned himself as a metonymic representation of all Black Americans who did not currently enjoy that right. His performance of tactical lawfulness took the law at its word. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But with help from the NAACP, Sweet mounted a radical defense of his humanity, not by ignoring his racialized identity as a Black man, but by publicly and theatrically reaffirming it through possession and use of firearms to defend his home against a white supremacist mob. Later, he would re-perform that identity of a Black American gun owner for crowds that gathered to hear him retell his testimony and even display his firearm at NAACP meetings throughout the country. After looking at Sweet's performances of home defense and trial testimony, I turned to the highly visible performances of the Black Panther Party, particularly their patrols of Oakland police and their protest march on the Sacramento Capitol in 1967. Their performances of tactical lawfulness, both on the streets and at the Capitol, represented an attempt to carve out a space within the nation where an autonomous Black community could thrive, free from the violence of the state. By charting these public performances of private gun ownership, I demonstrate that gun ownership, brandishment, and self-defense were used by Black Americans to challenge the power of the state and demand the rights of citizenship during the 20th century. All right, when he took to the witness stand in a Detroit courtroom on November 18, 1925, Dr. Ossian Sweet had to convince the jury of two things. Number one, that he and his co-defendants were acting in self-defense when they fired on a crowd that had gathered across the street from his home. And number two, that that he was a full citizen of the United States, entitled to all the legal rights and protections that such citizenship guaranteed. Sweet's ability to persuade the jury of either of these claims was in no way assured. In the first instance, the prosecution had argued that Sweet and his co-defendants had fired on the crowd without provocation, and so therefore it was not self-defense. Though Clarence Darrow, Sweet's legendary lead attorney, had robustly challenged these claims in his cross-examinations of state witnesses, and it completely fell apart, like the entire story, it was sort of a farce. There was no clear indication that the defendants would receive a fair hearing of the evidence. In the second, as a Black man in the early 20th century, Sweet had seen over and over that the law and Black Americans' claims to citizenship in the face of legal disenfranchisement and legal enfranchisement were rarely fully practicable, even if they were guaranteed on paper. There was no promise that even if Sweet's attorneys could prove that the shooting was justified, that it would be enough for the all-white jury to acquit. As journalist Marcette Halderman Julius observed, the central question of the trial was not whether Sweet and his co-defendants acted in self-defense. No disinterested person could doubt it, she scoffed. Instead, the outcome of the trial went, quote, to the very roots of the Negro's future in this country. Was or was not a colored man a citizen with a citizen's rights, end quote. Her observation echoed that put forth in a letter to the editor written by James Weldon Johnson. And he uses very similar language, quote, will the law guarantee these colored people the right to defense of their homes, which is one of the fundamental citizenship rights, end quote. Both Halderman, Julius, and Johnson identified the paradox of performed versus textual rights. If a person is a citizen in law, but not in practice, is he a citizen at all? The Sweet trial has largely receded from cultural memory, but it was sensational when it was argued. Though the NAACP would later shift its focus to securing the right to integrated classrooms and other public spaces, in the early 20th century, one of their primary concentrations was on protecting Black Americans from both state-sponsored and extra-legal violence. As part of this campaign, the NAACP supported the production of, ooh, where'd you go? There we go. Supported the production of Black authored drama that would act as a counterweight to both the demeaning portrayals of Black people in minstrelsy and the horrific theatrical spectacle of lynching. The plays that form the canon of this Black authored lynching drama depict not the violation of Black bodies, but instead the trauma of Black households, impacted by the violence of these two forms of racist entertainment. In 1916, the NAACP staged Rachel by Angelina Weld Grimke, and it was the first Black-authored non-musical play that was staged for a wide audience. So this is a really important play in theater history, too, in that it precedes even some of the successes on Broadway of the early 20th century and really inspired a lot of the Black playwrights who would start writing and become quite famous just mere years later. Grimke, later in her life, said that Rachel was created specifically to appeal to white women, to convince them that Black families were just like theirs, that the trauma and emotional impact of lynching were truly profound. She was hoping that the embodied experience of watching the family in the play would generate enough empathy to spark white resistance. To this end, the play is a sentimental drama set in a domestic sphere and is focused on a young woman, Rachel, who has to cope with the reverberations of her father and brother's lynching nearly 10 years before the play begins. So it's important to note that these plays resist any depiction of overt violence at all. And in fact, the emphasis is on surviving that violence, what the reverberations and repercussions are. Through their support of Grimke's play and their establishment of a drama committee, the NAACP clearly recognized the potential for theater and performance to shift white perceptions of Black Americans in the early 20th century. Ossian Sweet and his defense attorneys clearly recognized this potential as well, and they capitalized on performance's unique ability to generate empathy across lines of racial difference in the Jim Crow era. The Sweet case is also vital to understanding American gun culture. And why do I keep, okay. I think we're good. First, Sweet's defense of his home and the trial that followed was one of the first and most impactful examples of Black Americans turning to the courts to protect their right to armed self-defense. Sweet, the leadership of the NAACP, and his defense team identified the courtroom as a strategic space of the state within which they could tactically intervene, using the authoritative space of the trial to interrogate the very foundation of racialized justice in the United States. Second, Sweet took the opportunity of his trial performance to undermine the theatrical tropes of Black buffoonery, weakness, and shiftlessness that had been circulated by the incredibly popular minstrelsy at this time. Instead, Sweet placed the sober, traumatized family of Black-authored lynching plays on the stage of the courtroom and asked the jury, much as those plays asked their white audiences, to imagine themselves in his place. On the stand, Sweet began his testimony by describing the attack on his home in vivid detail. The Sweets had moved into the bungalow-style house on Garland Avenue in Detroit on September 8th, 1925. Their first night there had been an uneasy one, but had ultimately passed without provocation. The next day, however, Ossian and his wife Gladys heard rumors that there was going to be a full-out onslaught on their home. And so, Sweet testified, he arranged for 9 additional men to join him in the home to protect it against the rumors of the mob, or the mob, not the rumors of it. That evening, while Gladys fixed dinner in the kitchen, Ossian played cards with 6 friends. There was an abrupt thud as something heavy smashed onto the roof of the house. And when they looked outside, Ossian and the others saw a crowd gathering across the street. And estimates go anywhere from 100 at sort of the low end to 500 at the high end. The prosecution was arguing that it was 10 people, but they had other witnesses who came in and testified that you couldn't even get a car through the street. There were so many people. So it's a little unclear how many, but it was a crowd. Earlier in the evening, Sweet had taken his guests through each room and showed them where he had stashed an arsenal: 2 rifles, 1 shotgun, 7 pistols, and 391 rounds of ammunition. As more and more people gathered outside the house, those inside prepared for the onslaught. Someone in the crowd began throwing stones. Sweet testified that he then went to an upstairs bedroom to retrieve one of the guns that he had stashed there. While he was there, he loaded it and laid down on the bed to contemplate what he was going to do when a stone crashed through the window of that room, raining shards of glass on him. "What happened next?" prompted Sweet's defense attorney. "Pandemonium. I guess that's the best way to describe it. Broke loose." Ossian's brother Otis and fellow defendant William Davis arrived in a taxi. As they sprung from the car and sprinted to the front door, the crowd shouted, "Get them, get them." The mob of people surged forward like a human sea, according to Sweet, and stones continued to pound the house. As a rock shattered a second window, several shots rang out from an upstairs window. Then, Sweet said, it was all over. When the smoke cleared, 1 man was dead across the street, or he was dying. He died very quickly, and then 1 man was wounded. Although Sweet's recitation of the night's events was evocative, he gave a truly revelatory performance later in his testimony. Hayes had promised in his opening remarks 2 days earlier that the defense would, quote, show not only what happened in the house, but attempt a far more difficult task, that of reproducing in the cool atmosphere of a courtroom a state of mind, the state of mind of these defendants, worried, distrustful, tortured, and apparently trapped, end quote. That is, the defense would theatrically recreate the affective past in the present of the courtroom. This trick of theatrical conjuring was necessary in order to convince the jury not only that the people in the house that evening feared for their lives, but that such a fear was reasonable. Making the jury believe they were somewhere else and prompting them to feel the emotions of that experience is a fundamentally theatrical practice. To call into being the defendant's emotional experience of the attack, the defense made a novel claim that Sweet and his co-defendants' race psychology was the key to understanding their overwhelming fear. When Hayes prompted Sweet to delve into his frame of mind on the night of the shooting, Sweet testified that the whole of Black experience in the United States weighed on his mind. When I opened the door, so this is Sweet. When I opened the door and saw the mob, I realized I was facing the same mob that had hounded my people throughout its history. In my mind, I was pretty confident of what I was up against, with my back against the wall. I was filled with a peculiar fear, the kind no one could feel unless they had known the history of our race. Sweet's testimony called forth the metonymic power of theatricality in order to defend his actions. As the specific crowd of white attackers came to stand in for all white racist mobs, Ossian Sweet came to stand in for all Black Americans threatened by racial violence. The jury was asked to imagine their way into Ossian's place instead of the mobs. So their racial identification would have gone with the crowd. They were asking them to put themselves in Ossian's place. If they could do that, they would have to acquit him and his co-defendants under the legal doctrine of self-defense, and Sweet's performance of tactical lawfulness would have been a success. Leaders of the NAACP were delighted by Sweet's performance on the stand. In a telegram, Walter White, then the assistant secretary, told James Weldon Johnson that Sweet had, quote, helped the case tremendously by conveying his story with restraint and simplicity that held the courtroom breathless. White's description draws on tropes of effective acting. The courtroom was Sweet's audience, and he held them wrapped with a masterfully understated retelling of the violence and threat that permeated everyday Black life. In a moderate yet convincing manner, Sweet had relayed his experiences with anti-Black violence. He began with his childhood in rural Bartow, Florida, where he witnessed the lynching of 16-year-old Fred Rochelle. He spoke of the fear that prompted him to flee the South as a teenager and the racial violence he saw firsthand as a young medical student in Washington, D.C. during the Red Summer of 1919. He told as well of the Black families he knew who had tried to move into segregated neighborhoods in Detroit, only to be driven out by the violence and threat of violence from their white neighbors. His testimony made it clear that by the time Ossian Sweet assembled an arsenal in that house on Garland Avenue, his race psychology, the embodied experience of being a Black man in America, had prepared him to have both a reasonable fear of white crowds and the determination to fight back when they came to his doorstep. Sweet's performance on the witness stand was an act of tactical lawfulness, and he used his legal testimony to claim something beyond even citizenship, what Hayes described as the sacred ancient right of protection of home and life. By demanding ownership of this right, Sweet was performing his and other Black Americans' position as full participants in the legal, civic, and social life of the United States. Rather than ceding the courtroom to the state's strategic power, Sweet poached in that space, making it the stage for his performance of his racialized experience of being a Black American. If Ossian Sweet's performances of tactical lawfulness were born of a momentary need for self-preservation, the Black Panther Party's performances were instead direct public interventions that were carefully calibrated to challenge the white supremacist nation state itself. The Panthers' performances struck at the heart of penal and legal power, the police, and the legislature, and in so doing revealed the structures of anti-Blackness that made racial oppression not only possible, but necessary in the United States. Though they were by nature reactionary and short-lived, the Panthers' performances of tactical lawfulness revealed the haphazard and arbitrary nature of the police state under which Black communities lived and illuminated the state's own use of unstable theatricality to protect its power. In 1966, in Oakland, California, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which they would later drop the For Self-Defense. And though their outreach later expanded to include several community service survival programs, so free breakfast for children, free legal aid, free medical service, originally it was founded as a way to protect Black communities from state oppression by using violence if necessary. In the aftermath of the visible successes of the civil rights movement and the continuing challenges, such as high rates of unemployment, lack of healthcare, and unchecked police brutality in Black communities, Newton began seriously interrogating the value of nonviolence as a political philosophy, especially, in his words, when the police are determined to rule by force. In addition to acknowledging that police were willing to use violence against Black Americans, Newton also recognized that police utilized the threat of violence or the suggestion that harm was imminent in order to regulate the behavior of these communities. He said, we had seen the Oakland Police and California Highway Patrol begin to carry their shotguns in full view as another way of striking fear into the community. And he offered this as evidence that the police were increasing their terrorization of Black communities. This perception of the gun as an object that has the potential to generate fear by its mere presence, even if it is never fired, became a central influence on the Panthers' own theatrical self-fashioning and their deployment of the gun as both tool and image. It was the primary way that the Panthers took the state's strategic deployment of force and threats of force and turned it back against their oppressors. Before the Panthers began patrolling the police, Newton insisted that they learn both the complexities of California law and the intricacies of guns intimately, and how they each functioned in both practical and metaphorical terms. Newton saw the possibility for Black Americans to use both the law and the gun to communicate their will to power and self-determination. At the heart of the Panthers' tactical resistance was lawfulness, or an emphasis on exact obedience to the law as it is written. And this, Newton would actually take a law book, that was a prop that he used, and that was a very fundamental part. And he would search for very obscure laws that would allow them to participate in civic life in ways that were unexpected and that the police tried to challenge, but they could actually recite the law that allowed this. So for example, recording police and those kind of practices. The Panthers' early performances of tactical lawfulness were highly choreographed and captivatingly theatrical. Newton and Seal began wearing leather jackets, berets, slacks, accessorating with firearms and bandoliers. The French playwright Jean Genet, who advocated on behalf of the Panthers at several events in early 1970, argued that this theatricality was central to their goal of disrupting the oppressive colonialist white power structure. And this is from Genet. The whites recoil from the Panthers' weapons, their leather jackets, their revolutionary hairdos, their words, and even their gentle but menacing tone. That was just what the Panthers wanted. They deliberately set out to create a dramatic image. As a tactic, this use of belligerent theatricality may not have worked to radically change police and state conduct, but it did, as Genet argues, frighten white people. And it did so in a way that undermined their false sense of security within the state. The Panthers were not beguiled and led astray by the false promise of theatricality. The theatricality was the goal. At public gatherings that closed down street corners and thoroughfares, Panther leaders integrated guns into their performances of community cohesion. Guns were the natural accessory of the Black radical, writes Elaine Brown in her memoir of her time as a Panther, who were determined to claim their manhood by any means necessary. A firearm was the centerpiece of a theatrical display that announced a willingness to fight for their right to self-determination. The other omnipresent accessory, especially for Newton, was a law book, as Panther David Hilliard recalls. And he says, Huey chose to face the police head on and not with a picket sign, but with a shotgun, exactly like the one in their hand, and a law book in the other. He'd stand there with his gun and his book, reciting the law, careful not to step outside of the limits of the law, but rather using the law and the gun as a means for legitimizing the rights for Black citizens to protect themselves in the name of self-defense. In their patrols of the police, the Panthers undermined the supposed infallibility and stability of police authority. In the first year of the party, they focused on patrolling and protecting their own neighborhoods, but soon the state of California and the police developed new strategies for reasserting control, and primarily amongst this was using the legislature. And so they advocated for the passing of the Mulford Act, which would make it illegal to carry weapons openly on California streets. In response, the Panthers planned their most spectacular performance yet, an armed march on the California state capitol. So on a bright spring day in 1967, 30 Panthers marched toward the state capitol building in California. And they were conspicuously armed with 45 caliber pistols, 357 Magnums, 12 gauge shotguns, and as they had been meticulously taught by Newton, they pointed them straight up or down at the ground. And you can see that in this picture. And they had been taught to do that because it was against the law in California to point a gun at anyone for any reason other than self-defense. And so meticulously following that law was an important part of their performance. Taking advantage of the publicity as reporters and cameras gathered around them as they moved through the Capitol, Bobby Seale read the executive mandate number 1, and he was actually able to read it twice in front of the cameras. And so this event was, well, we'll talk about whether it was a success, but it was hugely influential, and it was splashed across the nation's newspapers and news programs. Newton later reflected in his autobiography that it was meant to fulfill 2 primary goals. It was to protest the gun law, but it was also to read the mandate. And he was really pleased that they were able to deliver the message to the people through that public televised reading. The transmission of the mandate was to Newton the most important part, so he was really happy. But in the end, these 2 stated purposes were eclipsed by the visual spectacle of a heavily armed group of young Black men and women in the state capitol. The Panthers' spectacular performance of gun ownership introduced the group to a national audience, and responses to this performance of tactical lawfulness were polarized, to say the least. While the striking image of armed Black dissidents encouraged new recruits from disaffected Black communities, white communities nationwide reacted with panic. National newspaper headlines captured this sense of alarm, reporting that the Panthers were invaders, raiders, and militants. The planned performance, a protest of the Mulford Act and a reading of the executive mandate, was overshadowed by the more metaphorical one. The guns themselves, transmitted through images on televisions and in national newspapers, actually performed. Newton and Seale saw in the March on the Capitol an opportunity to gain publicity for the Black Panther Party while simultaneously protesting the gun control legislation. But the optics of young, proud Black Americans openly displaying weapons inside the seat of government drew on genealogies of racial fear. And white people in Sacramento and across the country identified not the protest, but the threat inherent in it. The following day, the headline on the front page of the Sacramento Bee encapsulated some people's shock. The San Francisco Examiner used the same language. And to a certain extent, these headlines demonstrated the media's uncritical agreement with the Panthers' assessment of their own place in the United States. They saw themselves and often articulated that they were foreigners, more akin to revolutionaries in Vietnam and South America than to white Americans in the suburbs. But it also demonstrated that the Panthers' tactical performance of armed citizenship, however lawful, had communicated more effectively than had their ideas. In one Panthers assessment, the guns had, quote, upstaged the message, end quote. Newton himself bemoaned this miscalculation. He said the message was definitely going out. Bobby read it twice, but the press and the people assembled were so amazed at the Panthers' presence, and particularly the weapons, that few appeared to hear the important thing. They were concentrating on the weapons. We had hoped that after the weapons gained their attention, they would listen to the message. In this complaint, Newton articulates the status of the Panthers' guns as performing objects that have escaped the realm of controllable discourse and taken on their own material agency. Although he was disappointed by the public's focus, Newton nevertheless recognized the performative power of Black men and women carrying guns into the physical space that was strategically controlled by governmental power in California, just as he had understood that power in patrolling the police on the streets of Oakland. Sacramento was certainly a success, he said, at gaining national attention. Even those who did not hear the complete message saw the arms, and this conveyed enough to Black people. And so here, this challenges the idea that it was only the guns that communicated, or that it was a miscommunication. So it's a little bit, guns have sort of their own way of communicating. The power conveyed by the guns as performative objects demonstrated the potential for Black resistance. And the Panthers' performance of tactical lawfulness was a strike at the heart of imperial, anti-Black US power. had crafted a visually arresting spectacle made for television, the success of which relied on the execution of traditional elements of theatricality, such as staging, a script, and props. After the event, however, Newton recognized that the weapons, which were meant to attract attention to, not divert attention away from, the reading of the mandate, had taken on a communicative agency of their own. They, of course, recognized that the guns were not props in the strictest sense. That is, they were real, working firearms, realizing that the protesters who converged on the Capitol that day may actually have to use their guns for self-defense. Newton gave Seale and others the explicit instructions, quote, not to fire or take the offensive unless in imminent danger. But in acknowledging that the guns may actually have to be used, he realized the guns are never just props. So, of course, they passed the Mulford Act, they passed National Gun Control Act, the Gun Control Act of 1968, a year later, which the journalist Robert Sherrill argues was passed not to control guns, but to control blacks. And so we have a really explicit example of gun control being used very specifically to control the use of one specific community. Well, there we go. So by emphasizing the Black Panthers as the target of the legislation, these laws reaffirmed long-standing racial prohibitions on performances of armed Black power, like the one staged on the streets of Oakland and at the California State Capitol in 1967, and staged in a Detroit trial courtroom in 1925. I'm going to end there, but I want to just say that in my book, I go on and I look at a lot of other examples, and I think this really intimate connection between guns and performance continues to really influence how we talk about things. The fact that it's so common in the aftermath of a highly visible instance of gun violence to refer to the people as crisis actors is an example of how we really, continue to use that language to try to parse what's going on with these acts of great violence. And of course, the racialization comes up in that as well. We have the Parkland kids who have done these amazing, incredible things, which I should note they are theater kids, and have been trained to put themselves out there in this way. But that really draws attention to the fact that other groups like Collaboration in Chicago that has been using theater as a means to interrogate gun violence in their communities for almost 15 years don't get the same kind of notice. And if you want to talk about that in the Q&A, we could talk about maybe why. So thank you so much.